So we know the R3 is an amazing photo camera, but how does it do for video? We're going to talk about that and more in this review of the Canon EOS R3. Chris here from Videomaker, and in this video we're going to be talking about everything video when it comes to the Canon EOS R3. Now we're going to be talking about its pros and cons, what's good, what's bad about the camera. Then we're going to do a high-level overview of the specs. Then we're going to move on to its features like its weight, its size, its video assists, its media. Then we're going to move on to the tests we did. We did high frame rate tests, we did dynamic range tests, image stabilization tests, autofocus tests, low light test. We're going to talk about RAW. We're going to be talking a little bit about overheating. And then we're going to end with what other cameras should you consider if you're thinking about buying the R3. Before we get started, we understand that the R3 is a professional still camera. That means a lot of professional photographers are likely watching this review. And for them, we've made the 9 essential things that every beginning filmmaker needs, an easy shopping list that you can follow to get all the things that you need when getting started out doing video. So you can get that right up here at this card up there or in the description down below. Put in your email address and we'll email it right to your inbox. So with all that said, let's get on with the review. Here's the high-level overview of the specs. The camera can shoot 12-bit RAW, like we said, but it can also shoot 10-bit 422 H.265s. It can also shoot 8-bit H.2O H.264s. It can shoot a mega 2600 megabits per second in RAW. And its top resolution is up to 6K 60. Its top frame rate is 120p in DCI 4K, and its HDMI output is DCI 4K 422 10-bit at 60p. Pros and cons, it's pros and cons time. All right, so there's 2 things we liked, 2 things we didn't like. First thing we liked, 6K RAW, 12-bit, fantastic, amazing. Definitely a lot of data, but when you need it, it's gonna be all the information you need. But that leads us to the first thing we didn't like, which is overheating. It overheated in 6K RAW for us. It also overheated for us in high frame rate mode. We'll talk more about those in our tests, but it was a bummer. Next thing we did like though, is a really good low light performance. I mean, fantastic. This is a new sensor for Canon and it is very sensitive and we love it as filmmakers. And then the thing we don't like, which is really a really cool thing for photographers, which is eye control AF. Amazing, right? Your pupil can control where you want things to focus. That's awesome, right? Yeah, it is, but it's not for video shooters, not available for the R3. So that's a bummer. This is Canon's flagship mirrorless. It's a full body, big body camera. So it's just competing with the 1DX Mark III. Now that's a DSLR, so no mirror there, but we're gonna compare them because they're most similar in size. And that's what we really wanna get an understanding here. Now the R3 is 2.2 pounds, whereas the 1DX Mark III is 3.17 pounds. So really, about a pound saved with the camera body between the two. That's pretty good considering it's 3 pounds. So that's a third about of its weight. That's amazing. And then its size, it's a little bit shorter, not quite as wide, and is just a little bit deeper than the 1DX Mark III. So it is definitely lighter. It's going to be a whole lot easier to be shooting and kept around your neck for a long time for long shoots. Definitely a wedding photographer's dream or some kind of event videographer of some sort. We really like the fully articulating screen. It was nice to be able to shoot from really any position you needed to be comfortable and be able to see your shot. It gets bright enough to deal with the sun, so really no worries there. Would it be nice to be bigger? Yeah, of course, but it's not expected at all to be bigger. What you can do with it as well is its touch function. So you can access the menu, you can control the camera, do all those things like autofocus, tap, touch control, all capable through the monitor, which is also really nice. Now it has peaking, zebras, audio meters, and a histogram for your shot assists. Now the histogram will go away once you start recording. It's kind of a bummer. Not really a great thing if you are going through different lighting situations. Definitely going to be a hindrance. But if it's that big of a deal, maybe you'll rig your camera differently, but that's a different cost or an added cost. So keep that in mind. When it comes to the media, it has a CF Express Type B and an SD card slot. That's really nice for a couple reasons, but also not others, right? So if you wanted to have the same media, be able to have exactly the same media, so you have to buy different types, well, you're kind of out of luck. The two cards can be used in a different way now, right? So you can have one writing your primary shot, so your 6K RAW, and the other one making proxies for you at the same time. You can store photos to one and videos to the other. Now, there is a limitation to the SD card. You can only shoot up to 4K 30 in all I to the SD card, and everything above that has to go to the CF Express card, and those aren't very cheap yet. The SD cards are. Okay, first things first, here's 4K 120. Definitely really nice. This is accessed through the high frame rate mode. This is not with audio, doesn't record audio while you're doing this, but all full autofocus and everything works. In fact, here's the autofocus working in 120 of me running towards it. You can see that it did really well. Now here's 4K 60, also the autofocus. You can see that it's working well also. And 6K 60, which isn't really too much different than the other, just a higher resolution. Would we have liked to see even higher frame rates than this? Yeah, maybe up to 240 only because other cameras have it, but is it really that big a deal? No, not really. 120 is more than enough for cinematic slow motion, and you get that all the way up into 4K. Now, using our Xyla 21 DSC Labs chart, we would say there's 13 stops of dynamic range that's usable. Yes, there's 15 stops and we can see them here, but the last two stops have very little information and are unlikely to be able to have any kind of important impact into your scene. Now, this camera has 5-axis image stabilization, which is really nice on the sensor. And then if your lens also has it, it's going to work with it. That's awesome. That gives you up to 8 stops of in-body image stabilization. It did pretty well, as you would expect. Definitely not all the way to being a gimbal-like, but it is not bad either way. Here is it with it on. Here is sensor stabilization, optical image stabilization, and electronic image stabilization on at the same time. And now we have all of them. Now, when it comes to the autofocus, we're super impressed. We are able to shoot at 35mm at f2.8 here. And zigzagging across the floor there. Now, I shot this camera on a music video shoot for my band. We were doing some walking and singing. As you can see, he had his eyes with eye makeup underneath the mask, and the camera did have a little bit of a problem keeping up with keeping him in focus. So I had to use tap tracking autofocus. So I tapped on him and then it tracked him, and it did really well once I chose that as our choice. But you know, the eyes completely blacked out. It was having a hard time. But when I was doing it with someone without mask on or without glasses on or anything else, it worked really, really well. Now let's look at its low light performance. Like we said at the beginning, we were really impressed by its low light performance. In fact, it was noiseless all the way up to ISO 6400. This is really great for Canon cameras just to be able to do that, and we wouldn't have any problem shooting up to 12,800 with it. And then when shooting at 6K RAW, we saw it perfect. It looked beautiful up to 12,800, and we'd be happy to shoot up to 25,600 without hesitation on this camera, especially if you're downsizing it to be in 4K, because then your noise will be minimized even more. All right, so it's time to talk about overheating. We teased it twice. Now let's talk about the 2 times we experienced. The first, we were able to replicate. The second, we were not. Now, when we were shooting at 4K 120 over 8 minutes, 8-minute long clip, the camera would stop and turn off. Now, we had set the camera's tolerance to heat to high, so just turn off instead of giving a warning and turning off. It gave a warning still, but it didn't turn off until it couldn't be on any longer. And well, we think it's somewhat fair because this is the 4K 120 in all intra, so this is a lot of data. And well, if you turn a 8-minute clip that's at 120 into 24 frames a second, that's a 40-minute clip. And that's also pretty fair at that data rate. So Is it a problem? It could be, depending on what you're going to use the camera for, so keep that in mind. I would think the camera just needs rest between it overheating, but you could be causing damage over time if you're doing it all the time. And the second time we had it overheat was actually shooting 6K RAW, and it was not when we were active with the camera. So it was when I was doing a test for how long it would record until either it overheated or how long the battery would last. And it didn't last 30 minutes until it stopped recording in 6K RAW. Now, that was sitting on the desk. Now, I did a shoot, that same music video I showed you before, and we shot about 35 minutes total over about 3 hours, and I didn't see the overheating sign at all. It didn't flash a warning, it didn't give me any problems, no problems at all. So maybe if you're turning it on and off, it's not going to be a big issue. We were doing, 2-3 minute long clips, maybe at a time. So, really, you got to keep that in mind if this is something you're going to be concerned with. And then when it comes down to battery life, we experienced a pretty wide range of battery lives, and that's because we have multiple batteries that we've used that also work on the 1DX Mark II and Mark III. So we had a range between 2 hours and 2 hours and 45 minutes of recording. It's definitely doable to get through a whole day with just 2 batteries without having too much of a problem. Now we talk about the marketplace, the other cameras that you probably ought to consider, just think about, right? So it's a full body, full frame, flagship mirrorless camera, right? So, well, let's just look at the other brands. Nikon has the Z9, which is $5,500. Now it has full body, it's full frame. It also has IBIS, in-body image stabilization, and has a log curve, but it has a 45.7 megapixel stacked CMOS sensor. It can shoot 8K 30, but in 10-bit internally. It can capture internal in ProRes, and then the comparison we've been giving the whole time, which is the 1DX Mark III, it's still $6,500. It's full body, full frame, but the difference is it shoots 5.5K RAW internal and has no IBIS, no in-body image stabilization. So it comes down to it, should you buy this camera? Well, when it comes to comparing it to the 1DX Mark III, I think hands down R3 all day long. It does everything you need it to, plus more. The only thing you do is, I want a heavier camera that can do less, that's noisier. Nah, you're gonna want this camera. Now, if it's compared to any other camera on the market, well, that's gonna be really like what brand you're married to. Likely you're not starting out on a flagship camera. Likely you came up through the ranks of camera brands offerings, and you are now graduating to the biggest camera here. It's unlikely you're coming from Nikon over to Canon. It's likely you're a pro photographer and you're trying to have a really good video camera. That's likely who's looking at this camera. It's not likely someone's looking at buying this camera that wants a cinema camera, because there's lots of other cameras to offer at this price point that are far more built for film. However, this has some really amazing specs that you're likely to see in future cinema cameras from Canon, I'm sure. This is a camera that gives you everything that Canon offers in one package, and it's going to do just about anything you throw at it. It's a high performance camera for high performance shooting. It's going to be an amazing camera for wildlife and doing just the stuff that's going to be day in and day out. This is the camera that every photographer is going to aspire to have, is the form factor and a camera that can do these kinds of things. So absolutely everything about it is fantastic. The only thing we could say is we wish it didn't overheat, but we don't see ourselves running into that issue unless we do specialty like 120 frames all the time, or we're always going to be shooting 6K RAW. Otherwise, there's really not a big deal other than the price of media, and that'll go down with every day that passes. So with all that to digest, I've been Chris from Videomaker, and if you want to get that list of the 9 essential things every filmmaker needs, just go ahead and click that link up there, and you can get it right to your inbox. No big deal, super easy. Thanks for watching.